appreciate that introduction and the beautiful music and the chance to be with you this evening. You're going to vote for the Republican no matter what happens, so I'm not here to convince you to vote for me so much as to convince you to go out and get other people to vote. And you don't have to tell them that they have to vote for me or the representative or others, but you have to tell them to vote. And people ask me, well, why do you vote? Why do you spend the time? One vote's not going to make a difference. And for me, voting is different. Voting for me is not just about being the deciding vote, because I know it's unlikely that one vote will be the deciding vote. But I know the degree of sacrifice that was made by the sons and daughters of America to give us the right to vote. And so I vote in appreciation and recognition of that sacrifice. And I want the records of the state to show that I voted, that I cared, and that I accept that enormous sacrifice on my behalf and on behalf of our country. So encourage your friends, please, to vote. Now, I apologize. As you know, I lived in Massachusetts for a number of years, and that state is overwhelmingly in one faith. And it wasn't my faith, it was the Catholic faith. And everywhere I went, people told Catholic stories. And I actually been to the Mass, I'll bet I've done Mass at least 40 or 50 times when I served as governor. I knew the songs, I knew the responses. I was as good as many Catholics in the process. And so I apologize, because I'm going to tell a couple of Mormon things here, which is my faith. And those of you who are of other faiths, you've gotten so tired of listening to Mormon stuff. But I just was reminded when I saw this fellow here, this Richard Amoroso fellow that many of you don't know, but he's up here. We were in the same congregation back in Boston. And we would go to the temple in Washington, D.C. It was a 9-hour trip overnight. And he had the gall one time to climb up into the luggage rack on the side of the bus, because we went down in buses. And he climbed up there in the bus, and you could see that the powers that be in the bus were very upset. And we're about to come down and tell him to stop climbing up there and to get down. And that was until my wife also climbed up in the rack on the other side. And they decided to leave it alone. So it's good to see him and to have that experience. I'll also note that when I ran for president, I learned that you spend a lot of time in Iowa. And as a matter of fact, you spend a huge portion of the campaign. I don't know whether it's 50% or whatever in one state, the state of Iowa, and then comes, of course, New Hampshire. But you're all the years leading up to the primary. It's Iowa, Iowa, Iowa. And so I'd knock on 100 doors, and I'd say to people, will you support me? And about, 10 out of 100 said yes. About 40 out of 100 said they're going to support someone else, and then 8 out of 100 agreed to be baptized. So my religion got me in trouble from time to time. Now I had the chance today to be in Cedar City and to speak with about 400 students in Cedar City. These were students in civics, largely seniors, but a few juniors and a smattering of sophomores as well. And I thought, instead of just speaking as I normally do to groups like this about Republican principles, I would talk a bit about what I said to this group about civics, and to give you my perspective on who we are as a nation and why I'm conservative, why I'm a Republican. And then I'm going to turn to you for questions. I like to say that embarrassing, awkward questions are always the most interesting. So please ask away at anything that strikes your fancy. I began by asking them if they'd ever read a book called Lord of the Flies. Can you imagine asking them that? And a number of them raised their hands. Some of you read that in high school. But the whole idea was this was about a plane that crashed on an island, and a bunch of adolescent boys are on this island by themselves. And they form themselves into two groups, which basically go to war with each other. And I noted that over the history of the earth, that's kind of how civilizations have been run, which is that some strong man, typically a man, generally not a woman, but typically a man, some strong man, gets a few people around him, grabs the resources, the wealth, or the military might, and oppresses the others. And over time, they dignified that by saying it was the divine right that they became that strong person. So whether it was kings, or whether it was lords, or feudal lords, so to speak, or whether it was pharaohs, Caesars, and so forth, this is kind of the history of the earth. And if you look around the world, over the 7,000 years of recorded history, basically every major civilization or group of people has been led by some kind of dictator, monarch, and so forth. And and whether it's the Aztecs in the Americas, or whether it's the tribes in Africa and the tribes in the subcontinent, or the dynasties in China, the Mongols. I mean, that's kind of how it's worked. And it became a little more organized in the latter part of the 18th century, and then came an extraordinary breach from history. And there had been little pockets of experiments with other things, including democracy in Athens and so forth. It didn't last long. But this extraordinary breakthrough came from the founders of our country, who said we have an entirely different view of how civilization should be run. And we're not going to pick a king, we're not going to pick a president that's a monarch, we're not going to pick a dictator. We instead are going to have an institution where individuals come together to vote for others who will represent them and make decisions in our mutual behalf. And the object is no longer as it was in the past. In the past, when you had the kings and the dictators and the lords and so forth, the object of government was to amass as much wealth and power to the king and the people that supported the king around him, his courtiers and his military, as you could. And everybody else, it was basically to get as much from them as you could without killing or without causing a revolution. This had a new model. The new model of America was, no, the purpose of government is not to enrich the people who represent us or who are at the top, but instead the purpose of government is to provide for the life and liberty and pursuit of happiness of all the citizens. Amen. And in fact, we are all equal as citizens, regardless of ethnicity or gender or place of birth or sexual orientation. We're all equal. And of course, we're not equal necessarily in the way we come to the earth. Some come into wealthy families, others in poverty. Some have extraordinary athletic skills, others don't. I mean, we're all different, but equal in the eyes of God. The value of our soul, and from a government standpoint, the value of each individual is equal. And our objective as a society is to encourage and to provide equal opportunity for all people. It was an extraordinary breakthrough. And the founders recognized it. I mean, I recently just read the biography of Alexander Hamilton, having seen the play, and I was compelled to read the Federalist Papers. You may recall that the Federalist Papers were written largely by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in an attempt to convince voters to accept the Constitution. And the very first of the papers, Hamilton writes this. He says, "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide whether societies of men are really capable of establishing government based upon reflection and choice," in other words, reason and freedom, reflection and choice, or whether they're forever destined to depend on force and accident. Because the history of the earth was civilizations dependent upon force of a strong man, accident of good luck or bad luck in battle. But for the first time in history, a major society, a major civilization, a major nation would be based upon reflection and choice. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now that idea, of course, swept the world. All over the world, places where there had been monarchs got toppled. Even in places like England, the monarch was basically swept aside into a constitutional monarchy that no longer had leadership or responsibility for the nation, for the governance of the nation. And all of this culminated in the great final, if you will, confrontation between an authoritarian society and a free society. And that was with the Cold War, where for several decades, the old Soviet Union continued to pursue their vision of a dictator grabbing all the wealth and power for the friends of the dictator and the military, and subjecting their people to poverty in order to provide for these people at the top, versus the West, which was us and these other nations that had adopted freedom. And of course, that was a battle we won. I asked the young people today, do you know why we won? Why the Soviet Union lost and America won? Why the West won? It was because they had adopted a terribly inferior economic system. Their source of wealth came from communism and socialism, which was a disaster impoverished them. They could not keep up with the power of a free enterprise society. They couldn't keep up with capitalism because our economy got larger and larger, our military might was reflected by our economic might, and they couldn't keep up and finally collapsed. Now, interestingly, by the way, I thought the whole world has now figured that out, that freedom and free enterprise and capitalism is the only source of providing for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But now we have authoritarian regimes challenging that again. China coming forward. They've adopted free enterprise in a certain way, not exactly as ours, but they've sort of jettisoned the old communism, socialism, and adopted a form of free enterprise, and they're going to be tough. And they're based on authoritarian rule again. A strong person at the top with their friends being well cared for and the military provided for. And then the other challenge, of course, comes from Russia, where Putin, of course, is trying to establish in his own way the old Russian Empire. And so the battle goes on for the things we believe in. Now, I know there are some that look around the world and say, well, maybe there's a different model that's a better model. No, they're wrong. And the reason I'm a conservative and the reason I'm a Republican is that I'm convinced that Republican values and conservative values are the best in providing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'll describe that. Life. The Republican Party stands for the protection of life of the unborn and the preservation of life of those of us who are alive. So, for instance, we believe in a strong military. For us, that's the first responsibility of government, to keep us safe. And so we're willing to make an investment in our military might. And sometimes our friends on the other side of the aisle don't see it that way. But that for us is a high priority. Life. Then liberty. You know, we look at the liberties and the rights we have under the Constitution and we say we want those. We're keeping those. We're not brushing them aside. So our right to freedom of religion, our right to freedom of speech, of assembly, our Second Amendment rights, our rights of privacy and association, all these things we defend and fight for. And so when it comes to life, conservatism is the most compelling and most powerful answer. When it comes to the preservation of our liberties, I believe the same thing. And then the third area, pursuit of happiness, that refers, in my view, to the right of every citizen in our country to pursue their economic hopes, to raise their kids in the way they feel appropriate and desirable. And so if you ask, well, which principles have the most prospect of creating the greatest income and prosperity for the people of the society? Well, I'm convinced that our principles do. I had the occasion to be with Joe Biden. I like Joe Biden. He's a fun person to be around. He tells wonderful stories, long stories, but I asked him, what is the Democratic Party telling you should do to help people have their wages go up and salaries go up? How's it going to make the American people better off? Not the rich. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the rank and file of our whole society. What do you do to help the middle class and the poor? And you know what? Our Democratic friends don't have an answer to that. They try and say that we're wrong. We have answers. We say, you know what? If you want wages to go up, the only way that will happen, for real wages to go up, not inflation wages, but real wages to go up, is if businesses do better and better, so they hire more people, and they compete with each other to hire the best people, and to hire the best people, they got to raise their wages. They got to pay them more to get them to come join their firm. And so the reason we lowered corporate taxes is not to make stockholders wealthier. It's instead to make companies stay here, grow here, thrive here, hire more people, and get wages up for middle income families, and give poor people the chance to get a job and come out of poverty. Right. The principles of conservatism are the most apt, the most effective, the most powerful in providing for the life and the liberty and the happiness of the American people. And that's why I'm a Republican. That's why I hope to be able to take that message to Washington and to fight for the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I'm going to turn to you for questions here for a moment. And again, ask away, and then I'm going to come back with a couple of thoughts at the very end. But thank you for the invitation to be here. I appreciate the chance to speak with women and men. And the women, I know the men will try and take credit, but the women will get the job done. So I need you women to, there you go. I need the women to make sure and get your friends to vote. And by the way, you're going to get to vote by mail this year, as I understand it. Is that right, Jerry? You're going to get to vote by mail. If you haven't done that before, when the envelope comes, it's a bit confusing. One, you'll think it's junk mail and throw it out. So please be careful in throwing out your junk mail, because it looks like junk mail, number one. Number two, it's like take this envelope and fold it into here and sign this and put that flap down and then tear this. It's kind of, it's not real complicated, but it's, for those of us that are over 50, it's kind of complicated. So, by the way, I know that we've always wanted to make it easier to vote, but you got to be careful what you wish for. And I do have a story in that regard, which is a 60-year-old couple is walking down the beach, and they stumble across the proverbial lamp in the sand. And the genie pops out and says, I'll give you each a wish. And the wife says, I want to be covered in jewels. And poof, covered in jewels. And the genie turns to the husband and says, what do you want? And he says, I want to see what it's like to be married to a woman 20 years younger than me. And poof, he turns 80. We have wished to make it easier to vote, and we got vote by mail, but it's kind of complicated. So you women are going to have to, one, teach your husbands how to vote, and number two, get your friends to vote, and in some cases, get in your car and go over to someone's house and say, have you got your ballot? Let's get it in. So, because a lot of people think, well, I don't need to vote because it's only one vote, but I've described how important that one vote is for our commitment to the people who sacrificed for us. So with that, I'm going to turn to you and see if anyone in this group is brave enough to ask an awkward